Welcome to Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. This quarter, our Sabbath School lesson is Isaiah. It's a fabulous lesson. 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, lots of twists and turns, a ton for us to learn, plenty to study. If you're following the lesson, you have the opportunity to go deep. And I'm very glad that we have the author of this quarter's quarterly with us, Dr. Roy Gain, professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient Near East languages at the Theological Seminary at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Dr. Gain, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
There's a tremendous lesson. We begin on Sabbath afternoon with a wonderful story about a young girl who leaped from a fourth floor window high up in a building down into a net firefighters had held out for her. She was unharmed. The beautiful lesson is she trusted her father's voice. So in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah is appealing to God's own people to trust God's own voice. You'd think that would be a straightforward business. Clearly it's not. We know that from our own experience. We complicate what otherwise ought to be easy. But now we get into Sunday's lesson, Prophecy Fulfilled. It takes us to a beautiful prophecy, one we focused on, I guess it's a few weeks ago now because it was the Christmas season. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good." Verse 16, "For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you abhor shall be forsaken of both of her kings." You asked the question, so I'm going to ask you to answer it. Why does Isaiah mention curds and honey that the boy would have to eat? What's the significance of that, Dr. Gain?
Curds and honey were the diet of nomads. It's like the kinds of things that people like Abraham would eat. It's not the kind of crops that a settled population would eat. They would eat from their trees and from the crops that they grew in the ground and so on and so forth, barley and wheat and figs and olives and grapes and things like that. The idea is that the country is going to be desolate. There's not going to be agriculture as usual. It's going to be a little bit like right now, except much worse. Right now we have a pandemic going on, and a lot of things are disrupted. It was going to be a disruptive thing as a result of probably warfare. But the good message here is that before this child grows to be a certain age and a certain development, where he knows, oh, no, I don't want that, or I do want that. That's a very young age, right, where a kid has that ability to refuse or accept. Before the time that the kid gets to be that old, this child is going to be living in this situation of the curds and honey. But then the people who are threatening you, King Ahaz, are going to be gone. The threat is going to be over. So what this is really doing, it's giving a time frame within which historical events would happen. Because God had promised to Ahaz that if he just believed and he trusted in God, that God would protect him and he wouldn't have to worry about an alliance between northern Israel and the country of Syria that were against him and trying to dethrone him to make them cooperate with him in an alliance against the superpower of Assyria. And so, in fact, this did happen. All of this happened within 2 years. Within 2 years, this prophecy was given in about 734 BC. By the time 732 came along, 2 years later, then the country of Syria to the north was conquered by Assyria, and northern Israel was also, much of it, conquered by Assyria, so that a lot of the population of the Galilee region and the Transjordanian region was depopulated, and that they were deported, a lot of them. Taken away from their country. And Hoshea, the last king of northern Israel, managed to save northern Israel just by giving in and surrendering basically to the Assyrians. And that didn't last very long before he rebelled. And then Assyria under Shalmaneser V, another Assyrian emperor, came and wiped out northern Israel. But in any case, the Assyrian king, who in this case was Tiglath-Pileser III, would have done that anyway. Ahaz was faithless, and what we know from the historical books that correlate with this are Kings and Chronicles, what we know is that Ahaz appealed to Assyria. He said, I'm your son, basically, and your servant. He gave himself up to Assyria. Help me against this northern alliance. And he sent a big bribe to him, a huge offering to the Assyrian king. And then the Assyrian king did what the Assyrian king would have done anyway. And that's ridiculous, to appeal to him and give up your independence for something that the Assyrian king was going to do anyway, which is take away the threat from northern Israel and Assyria. So God knew what was going to happen, and that Ahaz didn't have to give up the independence, not total give up the independence, but to a large extent, make themselves dependent upon Assyria. Ahaz could have avoided all of that, but he didn't have any faith. And so he bribed the king of Assyria. Now look, this would be like, for example, okay, you have two mice, and two mice gang up on another mouse. And the other mouse wants help against the two mice. And so what does the mouse do? He appeals to the cat. Come, cat, help me against those two mice. Is that a very wise decision? Get the cat involved? It's ridiculous. That's really the kind of thing that Ahaz was doing here.
The Assyrians weren't the kind of people you'd want to team up with. They're notorious for their cruelty. They were brutal. They were awful. They were enemies of God. But this is the direction this king was going. So I'm fascinated by this, that you've got Isaiah, who was raised up by God. He brought an uncompromising message, a challenge, and we see it in the experience of others. These messages cannot have been especially appreciated by a king who was bent on his own destruction, bent on following his own foolishness. So from an existential point of view, how difficult was it for the prophet Isaiah to bear messages like this, to talk to a king like this, to prophesy to Israel, he was bringing messages of hope in God, hope through repentance. But these were some tough messages. I don't want to say doom and gloom, but it was strong medicine. So where was Isaiah coming from in all of this? What was it like for him? What sort of reaction was he getting?
Well, back in lesson 1, we talked about how God offered the people the opportunity to respond to his message of mercy. Come, let us reason together. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to make your sins that are like scarlet, like snow, and so on. And so here we have, in the case of a particular individual, that individual happens to be Ahaz. He's the king. And God is appealing to him in exactly this way. Come on, Ahaz, let's reason together. And here's the result. And so he's appealing to him in positive ways and in negative ways, warning and then offers of a good result if he'll follow God. I think it's very significant that in verse 3 of chapter 7 of Isaiah 7, verse 3, the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Sha'ar Yashuv, your son. Now, Sha'ar Yashuv, that means a remnant will return. And so that is a sign in itself. In other words, that, well, look out, because there may be a problem that only a remnant will return from those who go out to battle. You may experience defeat if you don't look out. So this is a warning in itself. But the fact that Isaiah took his son to meet Ahaz, what was Ahaz doing with his sons? What we find from the historical books is Ahaz was the most wicked king up to this point. Later on, Manasseh was even more wicked. But Ahaz, up to this point, was the most wicked. And he was offering his son or sons to a pagan god in child sacrifice. And so God is appealing to him in all kinds of ways. Here's a son who is a message from God. He is worthy of respect. And here is a warning, and here is a message that, in fact, God said to him, that ask a sign of the Lord your God in verse 11. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. In other words, here's a check right in the amount. You can have anything you want. And so God offers him, and then he doesn't even have faith in that. He won't even put God to the test in that way that God invites. And then God offers him a sign anyway. And Isaiah says at that point in verse 13, he says, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? That's very significant because Ahaz had rejected Isaiah's God. So Isaiah refers to my God. And then in spite of that rejection, God offers him the sign of Emmanuel. I'm going to be with you, which is the greatest sign, it's the greatest comfort and promise that anyone in the Bible can have. God gave that to Gideon, to Jacob, to many people. It's in the 23rd Psalm. Even though I go through the valley of deep darkness, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That's what God was offering to Ahaz here. And yet, Ahaz ignored all that because he was into occult, idolatry, he rebelled against God. He didn't want to have anything to do with God, not even to accept God's challenge to deliver him.
You know, that speaks to us today, doesn't it? Where God offers us all that and more. He offers us the everlasting life and peace and guidance and direction and the presence of the Spirit and the righteousness of Jesus. And so we can place ourselves in that same situation, a decision to be made, an offer made to us. What are we doing with that? What's in a name? Because here he comes up with Shear-Yashub, and he has another son, which is fascinating. I think it's the longest individual person's name in the Bible, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. What's in a name? Why don't we look at this name? The message of the name clearly has to do with rapid conquest, but who conquers who? We're in Isaiah chapter 8 now and verse 4. Dr. Gain, let's talk about this fellow with the fascinating name, and I'll ask you to do so in about a minute and a half.
Okay, this Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, his name meant something like the spoil hastens and this kind of thing. In other words, it's like the name Shear-Yashub. It is a sign that the Lord is going to be doing something or allowing something. And here, whereas Shear-Yashub refers to the idea of a remnant return, here it is swift as booty, speedy as prey. And so this again refers to something military. It refers to the possibility of military defeat. Now, it could go either way. It could be positive or it could be negative. But it's really a warning and it's a message. Likely, in fact, this turns out to be a sign that in verse 4, before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, that is a stage of development for this child. The wealth of Damascus, the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So this boy is a prophecy. He is a walking, well, not walking yet. He's going to be born yet, but he's going to be a crawling pretty soon prophecy that the Lord is going to deliver Judah from these northern threats. So, in fact, this prophecy happens even before the child is born. And so he takes a tablet, he goes and he writes the name of the child, and the child has his legal name before he is even born. And then the child needs to be conceived. So Isaiah does what's necessary, and they conceive the child, and then the child is born. And in fact, this prophecy was fulfilled. Before he arrived at that age, he was just a little toddler, or even younger, then this threat from the north went away. So here we see Isaiah and his children. And Isaiah mentions that you've given me these children as signs or portents. They were walking prophecies. And God was trying to get the people's attention. Say, son, what's your name? Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. What is that all about? See, and it's an opportunity for people to receive the message of God and his prophecy and the warning and the appeal.
Anchored in history, kingdom against kingdom, a nation in apostasy, a stubborn king, a faithful, bold prophet. The book of Isaiah has just about everything. We'll dig into this week's lesson more in just a moment. This is Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. You know that at It Is Written, we are serious about studying the Word of God, and we encourage you to be serious as well. Well, here's what you do if you want to dig deeper into God's Word. Go to itiswritten.study for the It Is Written Bible Study Guides online. 25 in-depth Bible studies that will take you through the major teachings of the Bible. You'll be blessed, and it's something you'll want to tell others about as well. Itiswritten.study. Go further. Itiswritten.study. Welcome back to Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written. Our guest is the author of this quarter's quarterly, Dr. Roy Gain from the Theological Seminary at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Dr. Gain, we're going to look at Wednesday. It starts with a wonderful historical reference where President Franklin D. Roosevelt said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Well, God speaks to Isaiah. I'm reading from Wednesday. God warned Isaiah not to fear what his people feared, but to fear him. Let me read this. Say not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy. Neither fear their fear, nor be afraid. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. We get asked this all the time. Why does the Bible say fear God? This sounds an awful lot like Revelation chapter 14 and the messages of the three angels. Let me ask you, I'll ask the question that's listed here. How do you understand the idea of fearing God? What does that mean in light of the commandment to love God, which we find in Matthew chapter 22?
Yes, and there is an additional problem, and that is 1 John 4, verse 18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. So how can we love God? Because perfect fear casts out love, just like perfect love casts out fear. How can we love God if we fear him? I remember hearing an evangelist quite a few years ago who was preaching on the first angel's message where it says, fear God and give glory to him. And then he spent quite a bit of time explaining how fear doesn't really mean fear. It means awesome respect and all of these other kinds of things. Well, when you go to Exodus chapter 19 and other passages like that, where the people there experienced God on Mount Sinai, and they were terribly afraid. And you go to Daniel, and Daniel experiences a heavenly being who may be the pre-incarnate Christ. It looks like that. And he falls down flat like a dead man. And other places in the Bible. God is so big, he is so powerful, that he engenders fear. Now, at the ancient Israelite sanctuary, you can imagine, there had to be guards to keep the people from getting too close for transgressing, just like there had to be guards around Mount Sinai when God was up on top, to keep them from getting too close to God. Because when you think about it, God is very big, and God is very powerful. And you remember what happened to Uzzah, the guy who touched the ark when he was trying to steady it, and he fell over dead as a result, just touching the ark of God. God is so big. I remember going to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago years ago with my daughter before she was married. We had a lovely day there, and we went to a presentation showing what it looks like in the Hubble Space Telescope out into space. And we could see how vast it was, millions and millions of light years across, just part of the universe, baby constellations coming out from Orion, and that kind of thing. And I realized how big God is. He's just like throwing these new constellations out like we play Frisbee. It's unbelievable. And here he brings all that power, all that glory in, and he concentrates it and comes into the Shekinah dwelling at the Israelite sanctuary, or coming down on Mount Sinai, or in a person appearing to Daniel. When we think of it in that sense, yes, we need to have fear in the sense of this is overwhelming power. God can do anything he wants to, but it's not the same kind of fear that casts out love. Because when we are in harmony with the one who has all the awesome power, then we're in good shape. If we, on the other hand, oppose that, we better have fear. So to fear God is to respect God and know that he is the one, as Jesus said, don't fear those who can destroy the body. You know, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, that kind of thing. Fear the one who can cast your body and your soul, that is your whole life, your eternal life, into hell. So it goes beyond just awesome respect. You could say awesome respect on steroids, maybe, but in any case, it's not the kind of fear of hating God. But this verse 8:12, reading from the ESV, the English Standard Version, is significant. Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. And these days, folks, we have a lot of conspiracy theories going around that are promulgated by a lot of people in positions, sometimes in high positions, all right? But don't be afraid of those things. Focus on God. That's why God didn't allow his people to go and contact the people who have the spirits of the dead, like necromancers, the people who bring up the spirits like the Witch of Endor. Don't go to them to find out what's going on. Don't fear, don't try to investigate Satan too much. Leave Satan to me. Just have a good relationship with me, and I will take care of those things. If I love what it says in Romans 8. If God is for us, who can be against us? We only need to concentrate on our relationship with God, and he will take care of everything else. Yes, he warns us to stay away from bad things. We need to hear those warnings, but don't be afraid of those things. Even though they're very powerful, God is much stronger, and he can deal with them.
Yeah, amen to that. So Thursday takes us to a very interesting place. The title is fascinating, Gloom of the Ungrateful Dead, and we're given some verses to look at. I want to get into the little commentary part there. Ahaz was deeply involved in pagan religions, which was heavily interconnected with the occult. They sacrificed to demons, quoting 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Occult worship. Why the warnings? What was going on with this brother? And what does the Bible say to us? How does it warn us very directly about the occult, Dr. Gain?
When we think of the ancient idolatrous worship at cults in temples and various other places in the ancient Near East, we generally think of the prophets saying, well, they're just nothing. They can't talk or think, they can't move, they can't walk or whatever. And that's all true about those idols. Those idols, though, were believed by those ancient Near Eastern people to represent gods who are very powerful, like Baal, who rides on the clouds, and he's the storm god. And there's Ishtar, who's very powerful. She's a goddess of war, and she's the patron deity of prostitutes as well, and that kind of thing. There was Adad, there was Shamash, the sun god, there was Sin, the moon god, all these different gods. They regarded the cycles of nature and the different things in nature, like the sun, the moon, the stars, and various things, and the cycles of nature as representing these gods and their movements and their activities. So this is why God sent a 3-year famine in the days of Elijah, because people believed that Baal died in the winter, in the unfertile season, and then being the god of fertility, he rose back up in the spring. And so people were having what they thought was evidence in nature for the existence of these gods. But what we have to realize is, why were these religions so powerful? It wasn't just because of all of their speculations and their foolish beliefs. They were actually, in many cases, interacting with demons. It was like when you go to some of the countries in Asia. I've been to one of those countries in some of those temples, and my wife and her family grew up in one of those countries, and they experienced that my wife's brothers, were threatened by demons from one of those temples. And this is like in the ancient Near East. We know that they were depicting these in their art. My wife has done a lot of research on these artistic depictions in ancient Babylonia, and they were depicting demons, and they were interacting with them. And those demons are still alive today. People today are interacting with them. And that pagan religion, and now neo-pagan religion, which is coming back in a major way, is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that here at the end of Thursday. There's a very interesting thought question here, and I don't suppose anyone wants people to get kind of crazy or fanatical about this, but certainly we'd love people to be careful. Look around at your own life, at the influences around you, and what subtle ways are you exposed to the principles behind the occult and various manifestations of spiritualism? If you can't totally avoid them, how can you minimize their influence upon you and your family? What do you have in mind? What do you have in mind when you wrote that? And what suggestions would you have? Because let's be honest, while we don't have to live terrified of this, we absolutely need to recognize it's there and real, and we can expose ourselves to the influence of demons in our lives. What do we do about that?
Okay, the occult is making itself user-friendly in a number of ways. One of the major ways was through Disneyland and other places like that. Magic Kingdom. Magic becomes very appealing and popular. Now, I'm not telling people that it's necessarily wrong to go to Disneyland. I mean, that's between, I've been there, we had fun, but be careful when you're exposed to this magic, that you don't get this idea that it's just benign, it's just fun, it's just a good thing. And if somebody reads, say, the Harry Potter series, now I haven't read it, and I'm not really interested in reading that, Interestingly, the author made $1 billion from that series and all the related movies and all the rest of the stuff, more than any writer has ever made in history. Now, that tells you something about interest in the occult, and that is all making magic and stuff like this, which is related to occult, user-friendly. There's also TV shows and movies which are popularizing occult. And it's intriguing. It's interesting. You know, people are curious about this, and maybe it's beneficial. It's going to help them. They can find out about the future. Palm readers and you know, crystal balls and all this kind of stuff and horoscopes. This is all part of one big package of trying to learn about the future apart from God, or trying to gain assistance in a supernatural way apart from God. Back even in the 60s, I remember there was a I didn't watch this. I noticed that it was there, but there was I Dream of Jeannie was a TV show, and Bewitched. These are all TV shows, and even since then, all the way through with increasing amount, there are these ways to make occult popular and convenient. We know that some leaders in various countries, including some like I think Lincoln's wife may have been, and another one of the first ladies may have been into occult. They were interested in protecting their husbands, their families, and that kind of thing. All this stuff is deadly dangerous. We need to just stick with the Lord, be aware of what we're watching, where we're going, what we're experiencing, the entertainment we have, and the theme parks we visit, and all those things, especially the influence on our children, especially our little children. We may have a larger framework, we may be inoculated against that thing, but our children may soak this in and then get more and more into it. In fact, lest anyone think that I'm joking about that, I'm not joking. We have some friends. My wife and I have some friends, young people who raised Seventh-day Adventists who have gotten into occult, Satanism, witchcraft, that kind of stuff. Okay, raised as Adventists. So it is not just theoretical what I'm saying.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gain. Very serious. What comes around goes around, and God is warning us today about the various things that Isaiah was warning his people there. This has been a great study, and I want to remind you, be sure you get this companion book. It is the book of Isaiah, Thoughts as High as Heaven. It's not the lesson quarterly, but it's designed to go along with the lesson quarterly to augment it and to introduce you to new information, additional information, new insights that you can't get in the quarterly. So you'll find it at itiswritten.shop, which is open 24/6, and you'll find it at other wonderful outlets as well. Thank you so very much. This has been wonderful. We'll see you again next week for another lesson. This has been Sabbath School, brought to you by It Is Written TV.